Welcome everyone to our webinar, Navigating Market Access, Launch Strategies and Health Economic Modelling for Medical Devices. Please see our YouTube channel for past webinars and look out for more content from us in the future. So for those that don't know us well, MedTech Access is a global specialist health economics, outcomes and market access consultancy. With a track record in expert delivery, we provide specialist support to MedTech and pharma clients. As part of the Patari platform, we now collaborate directly with colleagues in the US and Europe with a broad range of specialisms, all working to improve patient access. So firstly, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Juliet Wallace, Senior Partnerships Coordinator at MedTech Access. Today I'm joined by my colleagues from our Market Access and Health Economics teams. So we have Hannah Palin, who is the Director of our local Market Access team. She specialises in the launch and commercialisation of new healthcare interventions. She's an expert in developing materials that communicate the clinical and economic value that products deliver within the care pathway. We then have Calum Jones, who is Associate Director in our Health Economics team. Calum has deep expertise with early and global health economic models to support strategic decision-making, reimbursement and HTA. And then last but not least, we have Evelyne Priestman, who is a consultant in our health economics team. Evelyne's expertise lies in leveraging health economic modelling for the commercialisation and launch of medical devices. I'd like to say thanks to everyone who submitted questions in advance. Over the course of the webinar, we will do our best to get to as many of these as possible. Please use the chat box or the question box function to add any additional questions over the course of this webinar. And for any that we don't have a chance to get to, we'll make sure to follow up via email after this webinar. Amongst the attendees today, we have a range of experience spanning many types of medical devices and technology, including attendees based in lots of different geographies. We will therefore try to make sure all of our questions and answers are broad and apply to as many of you as possible. Okay, so I'd like to start with our first question to our experts, which is, why is it essential to establish a clear value proposition for an effective market access strategy in the medtech sector? Evelyne, would you like to start?
Yeah. So I think this is one of the key differences between medical devices and medical software and active pharmaceutical ingredients as an intervention. With an API, it's very clear what the effect is. With a medical device or a piece of software, it is not always clear what the benefit is. So you need to spend some time to really think about, well, what benefit is this providing to the patient, to the clinician, and also to the healthcare system. It's more of a traditional approach you would maybe use in consumer products to really match what all the different stakeholders require and need, and what their jobs to be done are, with what your solution provides. Because once you have established those value claims, that is really the core of your value proposition. And the market access and the health economics, they are there to support you in communicating that value proposition to your users and your stakeholders, which is also purchasers, etc.
Thanks, Evelyne. Calum, do you have anything to add?
I think that's really well put, Evelyne. I mean, I think when we're trying to communicate the value of a new medical device, I mean, it's a reasonable rule of thumb to try and focus in on, I think, 2 or 3, maybe 4, probably 2 or 3 value drivers. So we're thinking, of course, in the realm of cost savings, patient outcomes, or even perhaps actually sort of streamlined care practice. We might want to see a sort of a procedural sort of efficiency benefit there. And so in doing so, if we can narrow that down into a few value claims, value drivers, we can avoid actually just overwhelming our target decision makers, which is a very tangible problem that we can come up against, and ensure we're, in that respect, addressing their main priorities. And actually, to that end, I mean, this all comes down in a health economic modelling context to defining your PICO, of course, for your device, that population, intervention, comparator, and in this case, outcomes. And of course, this should be defined really from the very outset of what we're aiming to achieve here, and as early as possible. I would also note that, I mean, if we're trying to substantiate claims around those value drivers, using, and we're thinking about the data we need to use, actually, it's a good rule of thumb to be using data that is as local from the perspective of the decision maker as possible. That can be really persuasive. So reimbursement decisions for devices are typically going to happen, as many on the webinar are likely to know, at the local or regional level. To that end, real-world evidence from, say, pilot hospitals or regional contexts are more likely to resonate than we might expect broad national or international data to. So local is a good way to go in that respect, but making sure that those value drivers are few and as pertinent as possible, and that's inherent within that early defining of your PICO. These are key tenets to adhere to.
Hannah, anything to add?
Yeah, that's to echo. I think Calum and Evelyne have covered a lot of the points that on projects when we're supporting more, maybe it is models, maybe it's written communications or presentation communications. It is being able to go back to what is your core offering, and also reflecting back on how have you got there. So strategy can, in the development phase, be quite open-ended. It may have still cases where you're still to prove out whether you can stand by that claim or whether you have to adapt it. But thinking about it early as possible is really important, and evolving that strategy as you develop your asset, as you refine it, as you identify the most viable or attractive use case, which I know we'll talk about a little bit more. And then also bridging that out further as you look at different market dynamics and different stakeholder dynamics. So, but having that core truth, it sometimes gets referred back to, that core set of statements and claims, it keeps things consistent. It allows you to place yourself very clearly in the mindset of the people that you're engaging with, and also be able to go back and actually prove all the things that you are explaining, or even if you are in a situation where you aren't in a point of proof, you can collaborate with stakeholders to find that evidence, to generate that source off the back of everything that you already know or that you hope to prove as well.
Great, thanks all. So this moves us on nicely to the next question. How does the care pathway mapping and modelling help in identifying the optimal positioning of a MedTech product? I'll start with Evelyne, if that's okay.
Yeah, again, I feel, I mean, I've spent over 10 years in medical devices and software. That's, I think, we're also a big differentiator to what you would usually see in pharma. Your medical technology, your medical innovation, it needs to fit within the care pathway. You want to minimize any disruption to the care pathway if possible. So you need to imagine how your users will use it within the current pathway. Will it add to it? Will it enhance the pathway? Will it change the pathway completely? And if so, in what way? When should it be used? Before something? After something? Should it be used once, twice, several times? All these are questions that are important to define early on, because it influences not only your value proposition, but also how we will communicate that to your key audience and how we will model it as health economists. The cost and the health benefit of the innovation depend on where it is used in the pathway, how often it is used, and if anything, maybe what decisions it influences further on the pathway.
Okay, Calum?
Oh, I think Calum's frozen.
Well, in that case, Hannah.
Yeah, that's fine.
Come in there.
Yeah, I mean, Evelyne and Calum obviously come into this with can we understand the pathway and use that as a basis for modelling? I guess I come in from a slightly different angle, although it's completely complementary, which is how are we going to communicate how this pathway will change? How do we get stakeholders invested and tie them in? How do we tie in how that care pathway has to evolve or has to change or looks different? How does that meet objectives that aren't automatically just financial objectives? Obviously, most of these stakeholders do have a financial objective, but you know, lots of the words that we know are time and time coming back again. How does this link into sustainability targets? How does this link into benefits for the patient? How does this drive care into a more of an outpatient environment, for example? So a care pathway and a care pathway understanding can really support a lot of activities, a lot of things that you may need to prove to kind of drive uptake, but also as a way of engaging and get stakeholders invested in making the changes and really understand the changes. And also, care pathways should, if done well and if rigorous and if kind of up to date, take out an element of risk for stakeholders, because they should be able to, through quantitative methods or qualitative methods, be able to implement your device, whatever that might be, seamlessly into what they are. But I think that's the caveat, is what we often find is there is no one size fits all for care pathways, especially in situations where funding and reimbursement decisions is at a devolved level. Maybe some of you might have seen recently, there's been white papers and similar talking specifically for the UK about some technologies around software and similar shouldn't be devolved anymore, and they should be more a centralized decision. But every market will be handling these differently. Each device and where it fits and how it's going to be reimbursed will affect ultimately what a care pathway or how many care pathways you need to consider. So for me, a care pathway should also be complementary to a reimbursement pathway or a funding pathway. So maybe that's just a few examples of where we've been developing them to support various clients, and where we've seen looking at a care pathway as a particularly pertinent and important piece to do.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
It's also important to add there's obviously huge variability in care pathways. Something may be done, a disease may be managed in one way in the UK, it's managed in a completely different way involving completely different healthcare professionals in the US. So that's something also to bear in mind. We try and maximize the flexibility within our models to account and to allow for different care pathways depending on who your audience are. But that's something to bear in mind. There can be a lot of variability in terms of how things are done.
Absolutely. Can I just quickly check, Juliet, can you hear me?
I can
yes,
hear
we
you.
can.
Well, I'd like to apologize to everyone for my webcam not working. Not ideal on a webinar, but if I can be heard, that's great. Really good points, Evelyn and Hannah. I just add that of course, from a health economic modelling perspective, whether our device is going to be replacing or adding to the existing standard of care is extremely important. The critical consideration. It's going to directly inform how we define the device's PICO, that population intervention comparator outcome. It really is framed around that, and therefore understanding from as early as possible, actually, in our endeavour here, the pathway that we're either adding to or indeed replacing. That's really couldn't be more important. And actually, if we're outlining each step in the care journey or the patient journey, ideally from really diagnosis right through to follow-up, that can set us up really nicely to assess which staff, resources or procedures the new device might affect, of course, or which clinical outcomes are going to be of most pertinence and feasible to demonstrate the benefit in. Ultimately, of course, what we want to do is create that detailed picture of that existing care pathway, putting us in nice, good stead to ensuring that we're measuring what truly matters for the decision makers at hand.
Thanks, everyone. That's really interesting. So this one is actually probably most relevant to you, Calum. Why is it important to start health economic modelling early in the product development process, and what benefits does it bring? Yeah, no,
brilliant. Thanks. Good question. So, when you first come to substantiating claims for a new medical device, particularly at the local procurement level, which certainly in the UK is the standard approach, it's usually required to demonstrate for our decision makers how it's going to affect their short-term budgets and their resource use. For this, it's particularly helpful and a good idea to source early stage data. So this comes to the need for early action here. So even from a small pilot, that could be really driven to uncover the key cost-based drivers, which obviously could include, say, staff time or consumables, and of course the costs, the bases for potential savings that might be readmissions reductions or reduction in procedure time, and we can use these insights then from that early level, that early stage, to inform the foundations of that initial economic model, be that a budget impact or cost consequence, which tend to resonate best with NHS trusts and ICSs and regional procurement bodies. Also important at an early stage, and it's probably in concert with planning and running small pilot studies, starting to really think about pertinent, I think, sort of scenarios essentially that are going to demonstrate it and really touch on the key value claims that we were making. So what scenarios do we think are going to give a payer, a local decision maker, a sense that we've tested a broad range of real world possibilities, such that we can enhance their overall confidence? And usually what we'll do is we'll start with a best case scenario, let's say where, for example, with the device training ramps up smoothly over time, complication rates will drop. And a worst case scenario, counter to that, where, say, adoption is going to hit a snag or costs overrun. And then we can look to refine these scenarios as we start to collect more data. Ergo, of course, hence we can see that starting as early as possible is key to making sure that as we progress down that time, we're adding to perhaps early stage pilot studies. We're thinking of introducing registry data. We're thinking of introducing natural history data to establish a good external control arm. But it's really all about, as early as possible, trying to understand how can we demonstrate to a decision maker, a target decision maker, that we are not presenting a theoretical or broadly inapplicable set of data and assumptions and scenarios to the needs of that individual decision maker, but actually they reflect real world consequences, and indeed actually reflects the feasibility of rolling out a device in a center or a setting that actually looks like that of the decision maker. We can never find that it wasn't worth starting as early as possible in these projects.
I'd just like to add to that also there's value in doing some early modeling before you have data, before the pilot stage. And I have done many of those models. They are for internal use only. You wouldn't show them to external stakeholders. However, they're incredibly useful, to find out what is out there, what evidence do we have. Usually it's combined with a literature review of some kind, because there may well be enough evidence out there, or a lot of evidence out there, that reduces the amount of data you will have to collect eventually in a study. And also to test your value claims. I have done many of those models where we've quantified all the value claims that the innovator wanted to make, and then run a sensitivity analysis, run some scenario analysis, and you can look at and see which ones have the biggest impact. And the biggest impact in terms of health outcome and or budget impact may not always be the one that you thought was the most impactful. And trying to quantify these in an early model and playing around with it a little bit internally will crystallize more which are the big hitters in terms of your claims. What are the claims where your innovation really makes a big difference? And that's where early modeling can be really, really useful.
Great, I'm sure that's really helpful for our listeners. Okay, so moving on to the next question. So I know we've mentioned pilots quite a few times in that previous answer, so let's focus on that. Lots of medtech companies are asked to do pilots. Where does this sit in this conversation?
I wonder, Evelyne, if you want to
start with Evelyne for that one.
Yeah, this is an interesting question because I think you'll get three different perspectives on this. So I have spent the last 6 years mainly with early innovation and innovative medical technologies and devices. And their pilots are really useful. Often the way we approach things is do an early model, leverage what is available on the published domain, account for uncertainty, and present that to maybe the clinical trials you need in a hospital, or maybe some hospital stakeholders, and say, look, we've done this, there's still a lot of uncertainty. How about you let us do a pilot in your site so we can validate the assumptions we've used in this model, we can collect data and therefore reduce the uncertainty. At an early stage, it's a really effective way to make some noise, to get exposure for innovation in some key hospitals. Ideally, you want to select hospitals that are full of KOLs who can then maybe do a publication on what they have tried. So from that perspective, in an early stage innovation, they're really useful. But I know my colleagues also have other experiences in this, so I'm handing over to Hannah.
Alan, would you like to comment first? Because I think yours probably is
Oh,
the least
very happy to, Hannah.
diversion from what I'm about to probably add to this conversation.
Of course. I mean, certainly from an economic modelling perspective, I mean, as I've alluded to already, I mean, pilot sites are a tremendous, but potentially pretty transformational source for informing the evidence base for our model. Because, of course, they're generating, and this is critical not just in medical devices, but more broadly, but real world evidence in everyday clinical settings. Incredibly powerful information potentially if executed and collected and communicated correctly. This can be pretty invaluable for convincing potential adopters, I find. And if we can observe through pilot studies, how the device is going to perform in the field, for instance, it's tracking staff time, training hours. Training is a large issue that could be overlooked at times. Clinical outcomes, complication rates, satisfaction levels of patients, then ideally, admittedly through a snapshot, because of course these pilot studies are not likely to run for more than a matter of months, usually, whether the expected benefits and perhaps efficiencies from using the device actually manifest in reality. And I can't emphasize enough just how important it is to be able to demonstrate that there is good reason to be confident that reality will bear this out, the projections of our model. We'll also be interested to see whether the device consumes more consumables, healthcare resource utilization than expected, and whether, for instance, these are interesting nuances in medical device evaluations, whether maintenance and software updates perhaps introduce costs that we didn't foresee before the pilot study. And pilot sites, I think, can also be useful for getting a good initial sense of which subgroups of patients are likely to benefit most from the device. This patient segmentation exercise can be greatly accelerated and enhanced through pilot sites, which obviously downstream is going to be going to deliver some nice efficiencies for helping us to focus in on those best suited populations and segments. But sorry, Hannah, please, I'd love to hear what you have to say about this, actually.
Yeah, I think I should probably start by, I do completely agree and recognise all the positives, I guess, that both Calum and Evelyne have highlighted about pilots, and I do completely agree that they can generate that. I think, without sounding like the bad cop, I think I just wanted to reflect when we did have this question posed to us, is that frequently we are working with clients or approach clients or in discussions with industry or whatever setting about how can we avoid doing a pilot at every opportunity, at every site, every location that we approach, whether it's in the UK or any other market. They want us to run a pilot. They don't, even if we've done pilots before, even if we, have good, strong RCT evidence, etc., etc. So this is kind of, I guess, once you've gone through that first innovation stage, you've identified where you should fit and where you have value and where you've demonstrated quite a lot of that data generation. And that's constantly comes up in conversation, is we're constantly being asked to do pilot after pilot after pilot. How do we get out of this cycle? And it's really interesting. And I have to admit, it feels a little bit, it's unique to every situation. It is genuinely unique to the device or the MedTech that we're talking in question. It's unique to the market that we are talking about. And it's very much unique to what's happened before. And so I think that's why all the cases and the aspects that Evelyne and Calum have kind of indicated and hint at are so critical to ensure that you don't end up in this constant pilot cycle. It's really understanding what they're going to need when you are running a pilot. It's about ensuring it's powered correctly, so it is valuable, it is publishable, it represents what it is going to replace or what it's going to be complementary to. And those are the cases where we've seen the pilots that have really been successful and that our clients have been able to get out of that constant cycle of being asked to do a pilot before anybody will even commit to funding them in the long run. It's those sorts of incidences. It's when they've thought about how is the data that I'm going to collect, beyond just capturing a clinical benefit, how do we ensure we capture the system benefit in a way that is replicable for at least everybody in that market. So the UK, for example, is very interested in how long a patient is in a clinical setting, who are they interacting with in a clinical setting, which tariffs are being triggered, for example. So it's really important when you're designing these pilots is to try and future-proof and really think all of those aspects that people are going to want to see evidence for that don't come out of normal RCT type trial designs, and where pilots really allow you to do that. But if you focus too much on just, we want to see what a clinical outcome is, time and time again, we are seeing that people just end in this constant cycle of pilot after pilot after pilot. And obviously, the more potentially disruptive you are to the system, potentially that's also, I think, something that we often see of people being asked to repeat pilots, because they're kind of not able to explain and demonstrate how actually this disruption can be managed. It's not going to be painful forever. It's not going to need constant investment, at least from the healthcare system, and how they can see that trade-off quite quickly. So going back to the earlier discussions about understanding the care pathway and other aspects like that, they're the types of instances where we've been able to potentially shift the conversation away from we've got to repeat a pilot, we've got to repeat a pilot. And obviously, the earlier you can have that mindset, that's obviously an advantageous, because you're approaching it in that manner. Obviously, it's incredibly challenging potentially if you're almost doing it retrospectively when you are on the market and you're facing challenges. So I don't want to sound doom and gloom on pilots, because I definitely think they have a really valuable, important place. But I think I guess, caution is that you've really got to think them through. You've really got to engage with them, and make sure they really fit where you're going to place yourself in a given market, especially if your device has potentially lots of different use cases or lots of different slotting. Again, it goes back to where's your positioning, where's your valuing. But equally, if you're doing very early pilots, maybe you need that flexibility, and you may have to repeat them when you have honed down exactly where you sit in a healthcare system. So hopefully that's a few slightly different angles than what Evelyne and Calum explained.
Yeah, great to hear all those different perspectives on the same thing. Fab. So perhaps for the next one, I'll come to Evelyne first and then Hannah. So this is, how can you get your medical technology in front of key decision makers, and what are the bottlenecks in communicating a device's value to various stakeholders?
Bottlenecks, as always, data. Your data needs to be strong, your evidence needs to be strong before you take it to important stakeholders to convince them to do more than just a pilot. Because otherwise they will say, well, your data isn't very strong, you need better data, come back when it is better. Never underestimate that. So that's the biggest bottleneck we experience always, is if sometimes clients do go out when the data isn't completely solid yet, when there's still quite a lot of uncertainty, because they will pick up on that. So from my perspective, that is the biggest bottleneck, having the right data to make a solid case to convince stakeholders.
Great. Hannah, do you have anything to add on that?
I would say sometimes, and this is not unique to MedTech or med devices, the stakeholders can be the biggest challenge. Identifying the right stakeholders, getting them to respond to you, figuring out what's going to trigger their interest, who is the right stakeholder class for you. There's obviously a lot of research and gathering and information you can do to try and narrow that down, looking at funding flows, looking at what they're interested in, where does your device potentially favour some of the things that they are trying to achieve. But it is not simple. Stakeholders are forever changing. Markets change, the structures change, how funding changes. Stakeholders change roles. Stakeholders may have different role titles and different functions. And I think it's also really important that, in a lot of markets, stakeholders are are not just funding decision makers. They are responsible for lots and lots of different aspects potentially. So there is never usually one golden stakeholder that if you engage with them, they will make all your dreams come true. But there is a lot of work you can do to improve the chances of when you do get their attention and when you do get that time with them, going back to Evelyne's point about having the data ready, or at least having a plan of how you're going to communicate what you're doing next. You know, preparation is key, because you may just get a 20-minute golden window with them in the first instance, and they will make a decision of whether they want to continue engaging with you or not. You know, and there's lots of bodies and there's lots of people interested, you know, how we can use technology as a whole to improve healthcare systems is it's a hot topic. It's been a hot topic for years and years and years, and it's definitely seen as a key way of making healthcare systems evolve and be fit for the future. You know, irrespective of what market we're looking at, we've got growing populations, we've got aging populations, we've got pressures on budgets and skill pressures in terms of healthcare providers. You know, technology is time and time again pulled out as the solution to at least solving some of these problems or being part of the solution. But it isn't easy. It isn't easy to engage with those stakeholders, and things do move. So I think it's just to kind of, I guess, not underestimate some of, I essentially am referring to the preparation that you may have to do to ensure that when you do get that window, you absolutely make the most of it.
Great, thank you. This next one speaks to probably Calum and Evelyne more. So Evelyne, can you discuss the role of health economic evaluations in gaining market access for medical devices?
Yes, I think partly a lot of what we discussed is about that, even though they're not quite assessed in quite a stringent way as pharmacological interventions may be by NICE. Nevertheless, they are being scrutinized at the local level now more than at the national level, although now with NHS England being restructured, that may be up to discussions again, as things are forever changing. But they will be scrutinized, and both the impact on healthcare budgets will be looked at very strongly. We are in a position of scarcity, and that's where we health economists operate in. But if it does impact the health outcomes of a patient, if it improves health outcomes, that also should be demonstrated. So it is crucial to have your health economic case ready for when you start engaging with stakeholders in the healthcare system.
Great, thanks, Evelyne. Calum, yeah, I was just passing it over to you, but also would be great to see how you can capture the long-term benefits from devices as well.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, a lot of it, I think you're absolutely right, Evelyne. I completely agree. And I mean, yeah, I mean, absolutely. In the UK, most are likely familiar with day-to-day procurement decisions are going to happen locally or regionally. So, you know, that's again at the individual NHS trust or ICS or regional procurement level. As we know, of course, these bodies tend to have finite budgets. They'll tend to focus on practical affordability within a short time window. Because of that, quite naturally, the tendency is to lean towards a preference for simpler budget impact or cost consequence analyses rather than full cost utility models, which would be typically required by NICE. And as Evelyne points out, the evaluations for medical devices will happen through the MedTech process, cost per quality being necessary there, but this is going to be for certain high cost, high impact devices, those expected to introduce a substantial benefit to patients. And this is not the typical path for most medical devices. Thinking long term, I mean, often, of course, it's a classic problem. We have short trials, and we need to think, we need to extrapolate into the medium to long term for a convincing take on the longer term benefit and the sustained benefit to some extent of the intervention we're talking about. Natural history data, I think, can potentially play a really important role there in helping us to define a model timeframe of at least 5 or even 10 years, or actually, if we can, if possible, further, in spite of, as I say, of what's likely to be limited clinical trial data. And I mean, the key here with natural history is to, of course, observe how patients are going to fare over time without your device. Often, naturally, they're going to clinically worsen or incur higher cumulative costs. And we can create, off the back of that, medium to long-term baseline projections of how our device in question is going to alter that trajectory, probably by leveraging a series of scenario-aligned conservative extrapolation assumptions. But really, we need to be thinking about what data can we see already without the device? What is the normal trajectory of patient care and outcomes? And therefore, what are we likely to perhaps to see from our short-term data? How's that likely to be persisted? How's that likely to persist and extrapolate over time? And actually, the effort in doing that, in doing so, must be to ensure that the assumptions we're using are as absolutely transparent as possible, as well reasoned as possible. That could well be leveraging precedent in the space where the medical device is looking to address. Essentially, once we, of course, as we all know, we're going beyond trial and we're looking into the future, uncertainty just exponentially increases. We must make sure we carefully document and rationalize our extrapolations. But in the short term, as coming back to that, and it is largely a short-term consideration with medical devices, local committees are going to want to see near-term savings, tangible budget impact. But really key, as more real-world data is gathered over time, be that from pilot programs, registry data, or as I've mentioned previously, external control arms, we can start to refine and strengthen the model for the longer term. In fact, we'll see not just in medical devices, but across outside medical devices, actually, there's an increasing tendency and desire by decision makers and indeed modelers in response to that, to have that iterative refinement and strengthening of modeling assumptions and data within as real world data is collected, and that's certainly no different within the medical device space. And I wonder, Juliet, if I could just touch a small point on the communicating device value. I mean, when it comes to modeling, I mean, I'm a great believer in you can build an incredibly complex, sophisticated, impressive economic model for any intervention, but if it's a black box and it's very difficult to understand how you've justified or informed your model structure, the assumptions inherent within across patient movement within there, the data you've collected, how you've collected that, how you're applying that data, the scenarios you've chosen, and the impact of running those scenarios. If we're not clear about that, actually communicating that to a payer or a decision maker is an almost hopeless and usually fruitless task. Visual simplicity is absolutely crucial in these models. Maximal transparency. And really, I think always coming back to the idea that we cannot make good with any economic estimation or extrapolation unless we can convince someone at the end of the day that this is something that can be repeated and readily understood. And that has to be inherent to every decision we make, and the models we develop have to reflect that very much throughout every development phase, every draft of that model, every draft of the concept deck to support that model development. It just mustn't be lost sight of. That ultimately this has to be presented to real human beings who have a lot of responsibility. They have a limited amount of time to understand the proposition you're putting to them. It has to be clear as day what you're arguing, the basis for that, and what it means to them. Just a key tenet to bear in mind.
Yeah, for sure. So Hannah, from your perspective, what is important to consider when communicating cost effectiveness evidence with key stakeholders, and do you have any examples where this has been successful?
Yeah, so I think Evelyne and Calum have just set this up perfectly for this question, actually, and about, in the sense what we mean in cost effectiveness here, because we're not meaning this in the traditional cost effectiveness phrasing that we might use in pharma, which might make you think of ICERs and QALYs, and not to say that isn't possible in some scenarios of the technology that we're talking about, but as a general rule, we are not talking in that sense. We're more talking about return of investment and cost utility and kind of how's this going to impact my kind of budget impact models or my capacity models or those sorts of types of models where in essence, the stakeholders that we've already alluded to, and we've talked about, I think, through all of these questions, they want to see how quickly, when they invest in a technology, and in a lot of cases, it is an upfront investment on their side. Maybe that's through a tendering system, or they're having to buy a device, or they're entering a contract, or adapting and investing in a piece of software. I know some of the call may not be, they may be a physical asset that's a little bit closer to pharma type scenarios, but for the vast majority it is an upfront investment, and so they do want to see how quickly that investment that they've made will be returned, or how quickly the investment, not just in the physical asset, but in changing their practices, investing in a different service provision, for example, that this device slots into. And that's got to really be quite a core consideration, because it's a real challenge if you're talking around a decade or more before they are seeing any sort of tangible return. Most cannot foresee that far in advance at a local level. Most want to see it in a year. Ideally, they would like to see at least neutrality or savings if you're going to be blunt with them, and if you really ask them, and if they're being honest. That they are talking here and now. They want it as quickly as it's possible to be. Which, if it's a short-term intervention, so it slots into maybe an operating procedure, maybe it's a pre-diagnostic tool, for example, maybe you will see benefits very, very quickly, because it's about maybe shortening operation time or recovery time, or other aspects like that. If it's a device where somebody's going to be receiving it for quite a long time, and they only slowly get incremental benefits, and maybe they it's associated with a pharmaceutical product, and it means that their adherence is better, for example. Maybe they will only see the adverse events or the effects of not being adherent in 2, 3, 4 years time. So you're then talking maybe a population health type argument. So I think it's about understanding where you fit, and therefore what are you trying to communicate about the financial investment and the effectiveness of your device on that. We have quite a lot of examples where we've supported people do this really successfully, and even in situations where it's been quite actually a big change in how the service has ultimately provided. So one that springs to mind was actually for a diagnostic, and that actually quite changed how services were going to be provided. It was opening up the provision to a lot more individuals. It was shaping where the patients could receive their diagnostic procedure, and it was taking a lot of people out of the pre-existing services that had a very, very long waiting list. And so even though it was quite disruptive in terms of the service, and potentially increase the frequency that people were receiving diagnostic tests, and all sorts of factors that would normally increase the cost burden, and they did, because it could change the service provision to a more cost-effective scenario. It was incredibly successful, and they're seeing multi-market success in terms of its adoption now, and we were able to create quite a complicated model actually that showed how the changes in the flows of how patients moved. It was simple, and the user could get straight to, if I invest X in year 1, this is what I'm going to see, this is what I'm going to see at year 2. But underneath it, they could also access all the complexity of how we derive that, the robustness, and how they could critique it and really know that it was right for them, if that makes sense. So that's just one case. We have lots of other cases, and I know we're nearly at time, but I guess it's just to say happy to sit down with anybody and discuss how we might be able to support them in their particular role.
Right, thank you so much, Hannah. I think that really nicely concludes our discussion for today. So I'd like to say a big thank you to Hannah, Calum and Evelyne for such a fascinating discussion today. And of course, thank you to the audience for listening to our conversation. We'll make sure to follow up with any of the questions that we didn't get to cover today, and we'll be happy to signpost anyone to the right place if they'd like to continue this conversation. So thank you again.